This is part 2 of a recent video interview I did with Dr. Steve Sloman, who's a cognitive scientist at Brown University. He's talking about a recent book he co-authored with Dr. Philip Fernbach called The Knowledge Illusion: Why We Never Think Alone. In part 1 of the video, we talk about the book's core arguments, which is really in 2 parts. Number 1, individuals systematically overestimate the amount of knowledge they have in their individual brain, or really any individual brain. In other words, individuals don't tend to know as much as we think we do by way of factual knowledge. But part 2 of the argument is that this really isn't a bad thing, because thinking is less an individual process than it is an interactional process. So when we think, we usually interact either with tools, as when I use a piece of paper to help me with a math problem or store information, or in groups of people, as when I get together with networks, whether it's virtually or in real life, to help solve collective problems. And that's usually the way thinking takes place. In this part of the video, we want to talk in less theoretical terms about what all of this means for the field of education. So we talk about such things as what sense it makes to measure students' intelligence by IQ measures, which test solely what they do in the head. If thinking really is an interactional process, then maybe we should start measuring people's intelligence also as a collective thing. We want to look at what people's intelligence looks like in groups of people, not just in the individual head. We also talk about curricular and pedagogical issues. So if thinking is interactional, we might want to think less about school's purpose as amassing students' heads with large stores of factual knowledge, and more about amassing students' abilities to leverage the technologies and social environments around them to help them solve problems. That it might be more important to teach how to leverage these things rather than amass a store of facts that we can personally recall ourselves. At any rate, I hope you enjoy part 2 of the video, and if you haven't looked at part 1, I strongly recommend looking there for kind of the firm theory behind what we're talking about in part 2. So to kind of paraphrase all this so far, the first several chapters of the book are about the knowledge illusion, how we often overestimate the amount of knowledge we have in our individual heads. The next several chapters are kind of, but it's not as bad as we think, because we don't just think in our heads, we think with the world, we think with tools, and crucially, we think with other people. So let's get into some of the educational implications of this, because you do have a chapter, Making People Smarter, which is really about education, and you also have another chapter that's about the way we kind of think about intelligence. So let's go with the intelligence part first. I found that chapter fantastically interesting and completely relevant to education. Because when we think about intelligence, we almost always think about an individual doing something kind of in their brain alone. And you're saying, well, that's part of the equation. Obviously, there's something there. But you're also saying that we're missing something potentially. And I think you cite some folks who talk about collective intelligence, and that being almost a different beast from what we call IQ or general intelligence. So can you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. So the study you're referring to was done by Anita Woolley and her collaborators, and they published a science paper in which they took a large group of people and divided them into smaller groups and had each group perform various tasks. And then they did this final task, some kind of puzzle of some sort. And the question was, how can you predict the group's performance on this final task? And it turned out that using measures of intelligence, IQ, whether you took the average IQ of the group or the IQ of the highest IQ, the maximum IQ in the group, just didn't predict how well the group did on the final task. What did predict performance was how well the group had done on previous tasks. In other words, the group itself seemed to have an ability to perform that was independent of the intelligence of the individual members. And analyzing their data, it turned out that some of the predictors of which groups did best had to do with how well the groups worked together, right? So how many turns they took in conversation, those kinds of things. I forget the specific measures they used. I do remember one of them was the number of women in the group. Mm-hmm. So having more women turned out to make for a more effective group, presumably because it interacted better.
Right. You know, another thing about IQ tests that I've always found interesting along the same lines is that no IQ test that I'm aware of, and I'm not an IQ specialist, but I know several people who study it, and they agree that IQ tests, as a rule, do not allow manipulation of tools. So any math calculations you do, you're doing in your head, rather than with a piece of paper. Any shape manipulations that you're doing, you manipulate three-dimensional objects, is supposed to be done solely in the head. So we have the idea that IQ is really something that's all about what you do in your individual heads. And I guess similar to the collective intelligence idea, it would be interesting to see a study where we test how well someone does these calculations in their head, and then test how well they do with tools, and see if interpersonally, if there's a difference. Maybe someone scores very low if they only do things in their head, but might score higher than average if they are allowed tools to do them with. I've always been curious. To my knowledge, no study has ever been done about that. But
yeah, I don't know of any either. But look, it's important to remember that there is a solid basis to the notion of IQ, right? Namely, whatever tests you give people, it turns out that there's always a positive correlation between performance on any two, and that correlation is represented by IQ. So right. It captures this very broad difference in performance on individual tasks.
Yeah.
But nobody really knows what that means or what it is.
Yeah.
Right? There's been debate about that for a long time. And moreover, it's becoming clearer and clearer that that's not a sufficient way to distinguish people, right? There are all other kinds of measures of individual differences that are clearly just as important for doing all kinds of things. You know, measures of empathy and measures of reflectiveness that are relatively independent of IQ.
Right.
So,
right.
You know, it's been held up as this sort of banner of human genius. And it's really a very small aspect of what makes people effective.
Right, right.
So the argument we make in the book, you know, following up on this Woolley kind of study, is that, you know, it's really important for us to start thinking about not what an individual's horsepower is, but how much an individual contributes to a group.
Now, going on from kind of our ideas about thinking as being something that usually goes on in the head, I mean, schools are a great example of this. We tend to look at schools as the purpose of them is to fill our heads with a lot of information. We usually do work individually. Group work is kind of peripheral. You do it occasionally, but it's kind of gravy on the turkey, which is the individual work. You give an interesting quote. Obviously, you know, you say that it's not wrong to say that schools' jobs are to fill us in some ways with information, but you go on to say it's not really the whole story. You say learning, therefore, isn't just about developing new knowledge and skills. It's also about learning to collaborate with others, recognizing what knowledge we have to offer, and what gaps we must rely on others to help us fill. So let's go there for a bit. What do you mean by that? What are schools potentially missing when we look at it? The job is primarily filling students' heads with knowledge on an individual one-to-one kind of basis.
I think the way we put it in the book is that turning students into independent thinkers is a very narrow way of thinking about what the purpose of education is, right? That there's a sense in which you want to turn students into dependent thinkers because that's how people think, and you want to make people better thinkers. So look, I think the right way to think about it is, rather than, so first of all, let me qualify. Often mastering a skill requires practice and repetition, right? So if you want to teach someone how to do long division, then they've got to do long division, and they've got to just sit down and do it many times. So you know, I never want to deny that. But in terms of developing a deeper understanding of a subject matter, what's important is to appreciate not only what you know, but also what you don't know, right? And what else could be relevant to a subject matter. So if you are coming out of the classroom being a master in American history, then it's absolutely critical to appreciate that, you know, knowing the facts of the American Revolution and the Civil War, etc., does not itself constitute expertise. A true expert would be aware that there were really important events going on in Britain and France that had a huge effect on the development of American civilization. They'd be aware of scientific developments in Europe and how that influenced the American Revolution. They'd obviously have to know something about Africa and the West Indies and how they were involved in the slave trade, right? So nothing is an island. No subject matter is an island. And to truly understand it, you've got to not only have a bunch of facts at your disposal, but you have to have an awareness of the surrounding context, all of those other things that you can't possibly be an expert in, because you can't be an expert in everything.
Right.
And more important, how to obtain that information when you need it.
Right. Yeah, the way I usually think of it, I'm a former high school special educator who was in a lot of science classrooms. And I don't think I thought about it this way then, but it seemed kind of odd to me since that when we teach students science and we test students on science, we test on a lot of factual stuff. And what we don't often get to and we don't often focus on is how to think scientifically. And it seems like it occurs to me now that the factual stuff that we had them retain is the stuff that's written in the books. And how to think scientifically is not what's written in the books. So if anything, we should be thinking of our jobs as getting them to think scientifically and get some of the facts that they would need to be able to think scientifically with. But not focus so much on the facts, because those really are in the book. If you don't remember some of them, you can go back to the book. And in fact, professional scientists, I'm sure, do that quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. That's apparently what your doctor does when they leave the room.
Right.
After they've looked at you.
Sure.
They're looking things up in reference books, and I think that's great.
Yeah. And when I talk to students about things like this, they always kind of they interpret it as, well, you're saying that we shouldn't teach facts in schools. And I said, no, we should be really intelligent with how we teach facts in schools. We should think about what are the facts that you really need to be able to think scientifically. Teach those things. And if you don't get around to other stuff, that's okay, because those are in the books. But really, it's about thinking scientifically. So all the facts that are necessary to do that, that's what you teach. And then the other stuff, don't worry about it so much because it's in the books. If they come out thinking scientifically, they'll be able to get those. If, just like doctors refer to reference books, they know what reference books to pick up.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It's worth thinking about the relation between facts and theories, right? So there's a sense in which I don't think it's critical to teach any facts. I mean, some facts are going to come across, and you know they're part of conventional wisdom. What's more important is to teach what generates those facts, right? So what is the underlying conceptual structure that ties things together? That's what really distinguishes an expert from a non-expert, right? That they have a framework to put stuff in. So I guess I'm going even farther than you, and I agree completely that you don't have to teach all the facts because you can look them up when you need them. And so I'm a proponent of open book exams, right, for that reason. But it's not clear to me that there should be any focus on facts. Some facts are going to come out, and some facts are going to be repeated because they're central. What's more important is to develop the abstract structures that put the facts together, that explain why those facts are important and how those facts came to be.
Right. You also talk in the passage that I quoted and elsewhere in that chapter about the importance of being able to know and learn in groups. I mean, the subtitle of the book is Why We Never Think Alone. And I feel like schools don't necessarily appreciate that. So I often wonder, like, what we can do in schools to make sure that when students are speaking to each other about, the topic, something that's interesting to them, what we can and should do, not to shut those down and say, no, get back to your individual task.
Right. That's a really interesting question. I guess one conclusion that I would draw from the research that we review in the book is that it's good to focus students on thinking about consequences, right? So people have a habit when they see something, like if you're learning, let's stick with history since that's what we've been talking about. We have a habit of focusing on what we like, what we dislike, what our values are, what we consider right and wrong or good and bad. But learning history is more than anything, I think, about learning about the consequences of things. So what are the processes? What actually happened? And how did that lead to an outcome in a way that's sort of independent of judgment? And that is something that it's possible for groups to focus on together in order to develop a true understanding, right? So if you take any complex system or complex event, it's really impossible for any one person to master all aspects of it. But different students can master different aspects of it, and they can discuss, they can agree on, they can generate predictions about the consequences of what they understand, right? Like for teaching history, an interesting project might be to do something like have the group try to predict the future, right? And that would entail a real understanding, a deep understanding of what it is that they're talking about. So I've learned since writing the book that there's actually a lot of controversy in the education community about the value of group learning. Everyone seems to think it has a positive benefit, but some people say the benefit is so tiny it's not worth it. And it's important to understand that, we're not promoting any kind of group learning. It's not just like putting kids together is going to facilitate learning. Because as I say, if there's a really disruptive kid, for instance, or if the kids aren't focused, then it's going to be completely ineffective. But humans do have this special ability that's actually unique to humans of sharing goals, sharing intentions. And if you can give kids a common goal, if you can get them focused on the same thing and working together to achieve it, then I think there is some evidence that is really good. And in the book we review work by an education researcher named Anne Brown, who had this jigsaw method of teaching that she argued the data showed was very effective. And that's my understanding too.
Yeah, I currently, in my college teaching, and I wish I had during my high school teaching, use a Socratic seminar approach. So it'll often be that if we're reading a common text, we'll get together literally in a circle, and a student will throw out a question or an idea that the chapter got them thinking about. And what we notice, I think, generally to a person is that the thoughts that everyone leaves with are greater than what any individual could have thought on their own, because you have the benefit of 15 plus people who all saw different things and all thought different things about a text. And once we share that, going back to the idea of social thinking, once you share those things and it gets someone else thinking, then they have an idea, they share it, and it gets someone else thinking, and then it's almost the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. You couldn't have generated that if one person was thinking alone.
No, absolutely. Well, look, we experience that anytime we go out for dinner, right, and have a conversation with a group of people. The conversation is rarely one that could be carried by one person. And if it could, then it's usually a pretty boring conversation.
Right.
But when everybody's participating, then there is clearly something that emerges that's greater than the sum of its parts. And of course, there's another huge advantage to teaching that way, which is that you're getting students to actively participate.
Right.
And in my experience, is the number one most important aspect of teaching, to get students' attention, and you do that by getting them to contribute. So even at the university level, even when I'm teaching large lecture courses of 200 or more students, I still ask the class questions, and I still give them an opportunity to respond. I try not to let it get too chaotic, but I think getting students to actively think about the subject matter is absolutely critical, and that falls out of this collaborative learning process.
Yeah, great. Well, I think that probably takes us to the end, unless there's anything that we haven't covered in terms of educational import from the book that you can think of that we want to talk about for educators.
I'll just leave you with the thought that perhaps the most important thing, not only for students but for teachers, is to recognize their ignorance and to introduce a little humility into their interactions. Educators can learn from students, for sure, but it's also the case that educators usually are the experts, and the students do have to learn to respect expertise.
Right. Great. Well, Stephen Sloman, thank you for sitting down with us today. And even though your book that you co-wrote with Philip Fernbach, The Knowledge Illusion, isn't specifically about education, but for one chapter, there's just a lot of stuff in there. I encourage anyone who's interested in what we've just been talking about to pick up the book. It's a fascinating read about thinking and how knowledge is created and things like that. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. This was fun.